We sort of look back at the silent era as somewhat archaic, but from their point of view, it was a time of innovation. They wanted to have techniques that would help them tell stories more effectively. Certainly, Chaplin's The Gold Rush is a fantastic comedy with visual effects as part of his storytelling process. I'm a visual effects practitioner, so it's always been of interest of mine to see what was done before and to learn about them. That's been a personal project of mine to understand how visual effects techniques were created, especially back on a film like The Gold Rush, which has such fantastic imagery in it. While there isn't a lot of information about how these people did these shots or did the sequences, it's interesting to use your basic understanding of the techniques available and see how they applied it as part of their filmmaking craft. We know that Chaplin did go to Truckee, California, and a lot of resources went into creating this opening shot of the pass, of the miners. Huge production value. In fact, when you first look at it, you kind of think maybe it's a special effects shot because it's so well done, so perfect in its art direction and its consideration. The story goes that Chaplin and Fairbanks were looking at these stereographic cards one evening at Pickfair at Fairbanks's house. They were cards that would take a picture for the right eye and the left eye, and when placed in a viewer, it would give you a 3D effect. And that's where he got the idea, the inspiration for doing The Gold Rush. Well, they recreated the stereographic card almost exactly out on location.
The first idea that came to him about making the Gold Rush was Chilkoot Pass, where they had these hardships and everything, going over this treacherous grade, this mountain, which they call Chilkoot Pass. Yeah. He had that in mind first. So we went up to Truckee and photographed all of the openings. That is, we picked up about 500 bows from a bow camp in Sacramento, and had 3 trainloads of them come up to Truckee.
On that long line.
On that long trail of the fellas bucking this path. And with the ones who, when he arrived at the top, got exhausted and collapsed and everything else. Yeah. After completing that, we decided to go on and make the moving of the cabin.
Chaplin's cameraman, Raleigh Tolero, was fantastic. He worked with Chaplin for many, many years on most all of his films. Back in the silent era, the cameraman was also expected to do the visual effects that would be necessary for the film. So you would have to be a master of all the techniques that were available to a filmmaker at the time. There's actual photographs of horses in a team hooked up to this cabin where they're trying to drag it across the snow.
We were going to make it in reality up there. We had the normal-sized cabins and everything else. And we had a slope, maybe about a 35% angle slope. We tried to pull it down, and I took it to slow action and everything. We couldn't move the thing or anything. So everything that we try, I'd say, oh, we'll take it in miniature. I can do it in miniature for you at the studio. The miniature will it look like life? And I said, sure it will. Sure it will, as long as we build a set in the studio. And as far as focus is concerned, I can make a little small miniature cabin look as if it's a mile away. So you leave that to me.
My understanding is that they scrapped everything else that they shot and they went back to their studio in Hollywood and recreated Alaska, but on the soundstage. So either as a backlot with a street scene of Alaskan gold mining village, which would be false facades and salt and plaster for snow, or interiors, like an interior set where you would have a ridge and a painted backing that would give you the distance to recreate an exterior shot, but actually in the comfort of a studio location. The idea to leave Trekkie and go back to the studio to film everything meant that you wanted to make sure that you didn't feel that that was a limitation, that that choice didn't limit the production value of the storytelling. 1925 is a pretty early time period for visual effects technique. Most of the shots would have to be accomplished in camera because this was before convention of optical printers or more advanced, certainly digital technology wasn't even thought of at that point. So things had to be figured out in a very complex way. There's a fantastic shot where they had built on his set a cliff face with a ledge that he could walk around. Rolly Tolero used a visual effects technique called the glass shot to open up the view, to open up the scene, to create production value. So there's a sandwich of the camera, the glass painting, shooting through that glass painting to the set in the background, all combined through one piece of photography. It's a fantastic shot. We call it a Jeopardy shot. It's the shot that makes you think that he is in potential danger. He could easily fall to his death if he wasn't careful, and he skips around the corner as if to kind of give you a little comedic zinger that he's fearless. He would also use this technique again in modern times for the balcony skating sequence when Chaplin is skating and he's potentially going to fall off of a balcony in the department store. That is even more complex because they are panning the camera back and forth with him. He's building on his ability to use visual effects in his movie. One of the funny bits in The Gold Rush is when Chaplin turns to a chicken, when Big Jim is hallucinating that they're so hungry that even Chaplin the tramp appears to be a giant chicken that he would eat, which is, a frightening concept, both frightening and comedic at the same time. That's a fairly straightforward visual effect. In fact, the camera of the time, the Bell & Howell 2709 camera that was the workhorse of the silent era, and Chaplin owned many of these cameras. They actually included visual effects techniques within them. And you could make a transition from one scene to the next in camera without any noticeable change, except that the scene would change from one scene to the other. So if Chaplin was first standing as the tramp, and you photograph that fading out to black, then you replace him in the chicken suit, you rewind the film, and then you fade back open to him wearing the chicken, you get a dissolve. And if you look closely, you can see that this is a lever that says dissolve. And on one side it says dissolve out, and on the other side it says dissolve in. So what they would have done is, while they were photographing Chaplin first as a tramp, they would push this lever to engage it, and then rotate the crank. The crank not only photographs the scene, it activates the shutter so that it closes it during the shot. And then they would have rewound the film back to the beginning where they started the dissolve, and then pushed the crank to the other dissolve in indicator, and then cranked it again, and then the shutter would automatically rotate to make a smooth dissolve from one scene to the other. The scene doesn't change around him, but he changes. He goes from tramp to chicken. And it's a very straightforward technique. And again, these cameras were built to do that kind of technique. But because Chaplin brings his comedic flair to it, it's fantastic. He bridges the action so well. So it's not just a straight dissolve, but he thinks about how to make that dissolve effective. He flaps his arms to transition. He moves his head in a certain way. And those bridges happen during the dissolves. And that's why it works. It's a feature that I'm sure led to the Bell & Howell's popularity because it was able to do all these things, and it did surpass the more conventional wooden cameras. It was metal, it was like a truck, you couldn't break it. It was a heavy-duty system. It had a lens turret, so you can change lenses very easily. You could fade in, you could fade out. You had masks for doing split screens. It had all kinds of features, and it also had the ability to bipack. So this is the Bell & Howell Bipack magazine, and it's placed on top of the 2709 camera. Instead of a normal magazine, which would be the two Mickey Mouse ears where the film would be, it's a double magazine, a magazine on top of each other. It has 4 chambers altogether, and the raw stock is on the top, and this chamber is for an additional element. Why that is that way is that you have the film element, and then you have the opportunity for an additional element to be added into the scene while you're photographing it. That's why it's bipacked, meaning bi or 2 pieces of film sandwiched together during photography so that you can add something else to it. There's a scene in The Gold Rush where Black Larson has taken over Big Jim's mine, and he's out hiking, and he comes to his demise. The entire cliff collapses underneath him. It's really very effective. It's a miniature shot. So Larson would have to be a separate element that would be bipacked or added to the photography of the miniature while it's collapsing. First, you would photograph the miniature just so that you would know what it looked like. You would have the camera set up, looking at the miniature, you would photograph that, and you'd develop that piece of film so that you knew where Larson needed to stand on that miniature. So now you have a piece of film, you've kept that camera set up, you didn't remove it, that's a hot set, you don't change that. That's ready for the shot to be completed. But then you go on to a different stage. Black Larson is photographed as a separate element on a stage that was contoured to match the miniature so that he's walking on an area that would have rise and falls. It would not be a straight board. It would be contoured to fit the landscape of the miniature. So now that you have the element of Larson walking, then suddenly reacting to the cliff collapse, that is an element that's placed in the bipack magazine while you're photographing the miniature. And so at the specific moment that Larson reacts is when the cue would be for the miniature effects people to pull the set apart. It would have to happen on the exact frame, or the cliff would pull apart before Larson reacted. That would look really silly. It wouldn't work at all. In all of Chaplin's use of special effects, it's not just a special effect, it's completely integrated with the actors. So as Larson is walking and the cliff starts to collapse, he has to then be cued to be unsteady. He has to then realize he's in danger. So that's what's all making it work, is the connection of what's really happening to the characters being affected by their environment. In this case, he's falling to his death. A lot of these things weren't talked about. There wasn't interviews about how Chaplin made his films. In fact, a lot of his process was very secretive. He really didn't share that very much with the public, and also true with his production methods. So that there is actually an article for the Gold Rush in Science and Innovation which talks about how some of the effects were created is actually pretty unique. One thing which I think is really quite fun is the way that Big Jim and the tramp are inside the cabin. The angle is changing so that they're falling back and forth within the rocking cabin. And then that cuts with the miniature cabin on the cliff rocking back and forth. And also you notice that sequence, again, Chaplin being the master, it builds. So first the tip is maybe about 30 degrees, and the comedic scenes work with a 30-degree tilt. And then as it builds, it goes to 45, and it gets more and more desperate. And while this is all going on, you're cutting back to the miniature cabin, also on the angle, teetering on the edge of the cliff, about to fall off. We don't know exactly how it was done. Of course, in the Science and Innovation article, it says that there's these cables which are moving the cabin up and down. You can tell that the cabin's elevated because there are shots of Big Jim looking in, where he's peering in through the door. So it would have to have been raised off the stage floor, and it would have been moved by cables by Chaplin's staff, by his people, you know, strong people that could set the angles. And he would probably lock it off for some times and play certain action and then tip it again. This is the kind of thing, it's a real a precursor to what we do today on gimbaled sets. We have very elaborate hydraulic sets that can turn and rotate that we use today in film. So that's sort of the origin of this. The camera is always level, looking into the cabin, while the cabin turns around it. That's very innovative for the time. You know, usually you would just turn the camera and then people would pretend to fall one way or the other. But Chaplin put the effort into making sure that the set could actually turn. And so the effect of gravity is a part of the comedic process for that sequence, and that's why it works so well. The climax of this sequence is when the cabin actually falls off the cliff, and in the nick of time, Chaplin jumps out of the doorway. How do you do something like that? The miniature is set up to fall off the cliff at a certain time, on a certain frame count. So that's going to have to be synced up to when Chaplin jumps out of the doorway. Really talks about how they filmed Chaplin on a contoured set that was painted white. That piece of film is what we call the bipack element. They're creating an element of Big Jim and the Tramp as a separate element that they can then add to the miniature for when it falls off the cliff. And so the tricky part is to line it up and to know exactly when Chaplin was supposed to jump.
I had to figure out the dimensions of his height and the cabins and everything where it was. And then got back and they got a special lens and told him exactly where to jump and what to do and so on. So he still was no dubious. He didn't know what he was doing. He couldn't see it. Couldn't see ahead what I intended to do. I told him it'd be a double print. Well, anyhow, as I said, when he saw it in the morning, geez, it's perfect. Oh, he went nuts about it.
That is very impressive that they were able to do that with the very limited technology that they had. It really is an example of their ingenuity and their talent to be able to pull something like that off back in 1925. And it still works great today. I mean, that's the great thing about it. Sometimes you look at effects from old movies and you sort of go, well, you know, that's not that good because they didn't have the technology, but there's no apologies here. This stuff works great. It's very entertaining. It's entertaining today as it was back in 1925.